we can.
Each man must do his bit.
Hi and welcome to another edition of Public Interest. We're so happy that you can join us. I'm Gabriela Patram. With me today is former President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and leader of the People's National Congress Reform, Mr. David Granger. Sir, welcome and thank you for joining me once again.
It's good to be here again.
Sir, our discussions today is centered around the theme, the social contract. In June of this year, or this month actually of this year, we'll be celebrating 100 years of trade unionism in Guyana. Just before I get into my first question, can you give me a little background on that, on those 100 years of trade unionism in Guyana?
In relation to the social contract?
Yeah, in relation to the social contract.
Well, there's no social contract. It is something which it was assumed that the unions would be interested in. Over the last 100 years, trade unionism has moved from a period of confrontation, and it was to be hoped that there would be a period now of consultation and cooperation. Don't forget, 100 years ago, it was soon after the First World War, and the economic conditions were very poor. And in Guyana, the main, the commanding heights of business and enterprise were in the hands of expatriates. So there was an oppressive situation for working people. And when the unions were first born, or first permitted to operate legally in 1921, it was a confrontation between local poor Indian and African workers, and on the other hand you had largely expatriate employers. And that confrontation continued, as you know, the Great Labor Rebellion of the 1940s, and in 1948 we had some shootings at Enmore, but before that we had shootings at Rose Hall, and there were several riots on the plantations. After that we moved into a period of politicization of the unions, and we are now in a stage in which there is no longer any hostile or violent confrontation. But throughout this entire period you felt that the trade unions would be interested in avoiding confrontation and getting the best for their workers. Similarly, the employers would be interested in getting the best out of their workers, and at the same time ensuring that they could produce commodities or deliver services efficiently. So the idea of a social contract is an agreement, even notionally, an agreement between government, the trade unions, and the private employers. Now, this idea of a social contract is complicated by the fact of the United Nations SDG 8, which calls for full and productive employment and decent work for all. Guyana is committed to the implementation of the United Nations SDGs, and particularly SDG 8 should be of interest to the labor unions. And if we have a social contract, it means that the unions, government, and private employees must sit around the table and decide how workers will be remunerated over a long period of time, say 5 years, and at the same time how the government and the employers will get the greatest production. This is where we are, and because of the fact that Guyana is expected to reap the benefit of petroleum production over the next 10 years, say, it is opportune for a social contract to be conceived among the three, at least, government, trade unions, and private employers, so that we iron out the threat of strikes and dismissals, which still characterize labor relations in Guyana. So the concept of a social contract is very important now, perhaps now more than ever before, because it is very likely that we'll be able to, give the workers what they need to live, what they call a living wage, and at the same time, it is likely that the government, if it is mature and serious, will be able to cease this spate of dismissals, and the businesses could look forward to, making a profit, producing, manufacturing goods and so on, and delivering services, and the entire industrial climate will be more stable. That is what a social contract is about, but it's an old concept, but I think it's relevant now in Guyana, and I hope that people would re-examine it. There's hardly any talk about social contract, and I think Guyana now is poised to have more cordial relations among the government workers, particularly the public sector workers and the employers.
Sir, as you mentioned, the social contract is relevant at this moment in Guyana, given that we are enduring two catastrophes, which is the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're currently in a flood situation. What are the lessons for health workers specifically, households and livelihoods during this pandemic and floods as it relates to the social contract and so forth?
To be truthful, we are enduring three catastrophes, not two. There's the flooding, there's the pandemic, and there are dismissals. A lot of public servants have had their income slashed or completely removed because of the government's spate of dismissal since last August. The pandemic also forced a lot of private employers, private workers, self-employed persons out of the market, and jobs are not being created. And as you can see, almost every day in Guyana, every single region has been affected by the floods. So on top of the pandemic, you have dismissals and you have floods. Farmers are crying out for equipment to drain their farms so they can get back into making a living, because they make a living by farming, and the fields are flooded. Similarly, because of the pandemic, there are significant restrictions on enterprise. Businesses have to close. Vendors are restricted if they obey the curfews. Restaurants and other places of entertainment. And altogether, we can see that the workers suffer first, and they suffer most, because they are the ones who are least likely to have savings to literally tie them over these difficulties until things return to normal. And there's no indication in terms of the pandemic that things will return to normal. We know that maybe by August the floods will disappear, but they will leave a lot of damage. And the dismissals, many of the public servants who have been dismissed do not see any prospect of re-employment in the near term. What can workers expect? I think unless there is some complete reorganization or reorientation of government policies, their future is quite grim under this PPP administration for the time being, because of these three catastrophes. They are suffering now, and very little has been done to relieve the suffering of public servants who have been unfairly dismissed over the last 10 months.
Sir, on that same note, how would you evaluate though the labor movement's response to these dismissals of the public servants?
The labor union is not a united body, and there has been no apparent coherent response to the dismissals of public sector workers, and I cannot account for their behavior. It is very serious, because the livelihood of over 1,700 persons were affected, and I don't think they can turn to the unions for any assistance. The unions have all spoken out, but there is no pressure on the government to even establish a tribunal to examine each dismissal on a case-by-case basis and to determine whether the dismissals or the removals were justified and seek redress. And this is a task for the unions to represent their workers, not simply to publish a press release or to have a press conference. But I don't want to put myself in the place of the unions, but I think more could have been done to call attention to the plight of the workers who have been dismissed. And as you mentioned just now, it is a situation in which the pandemic and the floods have compounded the plight of poor persons, not only former employees but also workers and farmers. The situation is very grim, and the unions need to meet their workers and explain to them what they can do to relieve their plight. But nothing much seems to be happening.
Sir, under your tenure as president, you would have proposed a policy, which is the decade of development from 2020 to 2029, and you would have emphasized on education, employment, equality, and I have here economic growth during that decade of development. How would workers benefit from this proposed decade of development?
In my view, workers should have been the greatest beneficiaries of that decade, which has started. I announced National Petroleum Day in December 2019, which was the day the first barrel of oil, that could be attributed to Guyana's petroleum industry was produced, December 2019. That petroleum revenue was meant to go into a natural resource fund, but the whole concept of a decade of development was premised on the revenues from petroleum. Petroleum doesn't belong to us or the government or this generation. It's for all of us, for all time. And at the rate that countries around the world are coming away from fossil fuels and going to renewable energy, it won't last forever. So we have to make the best use of that bonanza. And in my estimation, the best use was to put that revenue into the heads of our children through education. The unions, the whole country, the whole world is moving into a technologically advanced age. And we need to ensure that every Guyanese citizen is not only just literate and numerate, but also, can take a place in the digital economy. And education is necessary. Employment, as we know, employment normally hurts the youngest persons coming out of school. They have no experience at jobs, and their first job is so very important. And we have what I used to call the NEETs, the not in employment education or training, NEETS, and that's why the Guyana Youth Corps was set up. What we needed was to have an organization which could train young people to be employed. In terms of the equality, as you know, our administration, our coalition administration, created 4 towns in the hinterland, what I call the capital towns, at Bartica, Mabaruma, Madia, and Lethem, to empower those communities and to be able to deliver government services more efficiently into those hinterland regions. The hinterland comprises 75% of the country. And if we want to have equality, it means that the services which are provided on the coast must be replicated in the hinterland. And a child who's living in the hinterland, whatever ethnicity he or she might be, should enjoy the same amenities and facilities and utilities as people in school. That is the base of equality. So you shouldn't have very poor schools in the hinterland and very good schools on the coastline. For example, everybody knows the what they call the Six Sisters, the big six secondary schools are all in the coastline. 5 of them are in Georgetown. 1 of them is in Berbice. But the hinterland does not have a single secondary school that could compare with those Six Sisters. And we're looking at those E's to ensure that we, as a country, could stimulate greater economic growth. We'd have a better educated population. We'd have full employment. We would have not only empowerment, but we should have greater equality, so that there is a broader base from which to choose workers can go into technology and other enterprises. And that's how the economy will grow. So the whole idea was that the working people, who constitute the greatest percentage of the population, should benefit most, and Guyana as a whole would become richer. So the decade of development is not a rich people formula. It is a formula for enriching the whole country. Everyone will benefit, including the rich, but mostly it was aimed at the poor, the workers and the farmers. And I would have expected that had that policy been adopted and implemented, the beneficiaries would have been the working people of this country.
Sir, you would have also alluded to the emergence of Guyana as a digital state, a green state, a petroleum state, and an education nation. What's the place of workers in your vision of the future state?
The future for Guyana is bright, and petroleum production is capable, it has the potential of making things better for all of us. As far as the petroleum state is concerned, we are now a petroleum producing country. I made this announcement NPD in December 2019, and as you know, petroleum production is continuing, and I think every Guyanese is interested in the benefit which we can derive from that production. So we are a petroleum state, and we must be careful to use the revenues for the benefit of our people. I pointed out a while ago that we need to become an education nation, so that we put the revenues into education most of all. We can become also a digital nation. Now, the trade unions need to ensure that their workers are given technological training that would equip them for the future. The days of manual labor quite clearly are limited in the sense that they're giving way to mechanization and to digitization. And the trade unions must be capable of leading their workers into more advanced forms of production and services. So in terms of the digital state, in terms of the petroleum state, and in terms of the education nation, these are all important. Now, Guyana, I've always regarded as a blessed country, a bountiful country. We are the biggest Caribbean country of all, and we have not only beautiful landscape, but we have an environment which is priceless, world-class environment in terms of, you know, our grasslands, our highlands, our, you know, jungles, flora and fauna. We are without equal in the Caribbean. I mean, you have to compare Guyana with countries like Brazil and Venezuela and Colombia. So, as a green country, I had taken initiative at the United Nations. As you know, here in Guyana, we developed the Green State Development Strategy.
Yes.
And it is not just a slogan, it is meant to inform everything that we do. In energy generation, for example, should be green, or building construction, solid waste management. Every aspect of life is affected by the condition of the environment, even disease. Many of the diseases we suffered from prior to COVID-19 were in part the result of poor environmental stewardship, environmental management. Many of them are vector-borne: chikungunya, Zika, malaria, filaria. And a clean environment, a healthy environment, would not only preserve our flora and fauna, but would also preserve us as a healthy nation. So those were some of the objectives in our broad development strategy over this 10-year period, to speed up the pace at which we are moving to become a digital nation, a petroleum state, an education nation, and an environmentally green state. I think these are 4 desirable pillars for the new economy, and I would think that we need to pay more attention to that. It's not just a political slogan; it is an objective that we should be aiming at.
Sir, how relevant are trade unions to workers' living conditions today? I ask that question because trade unionism was legalized in British Guyana in June of 1921. Do I have that date correct?
Yes, that's correct. 100 years ago.
100 years ago, and a century ago, right? And the British Guyana Trade Union Council was established in 1941. I have here. How relevant are trade union workers to living conditions today? And do you have any suggestions, probably, how they can better represent workers and their plights?
Trade unionism is very important historically. It always has been, and it is my expectation that it will continue to be important to not only to the working class, but to the entire economy and to the entire country. In the beginning, as I said a few minutes ago, the posture was confrontational, and there were very bad riots. There were shootings and killings on the plantations and elsewhere. But more or less we've gone past that stage now. Certainly trade unions played an important role in the independence struggle. Now we have to focus on the welfare of our working people. And again, it might be a little unfair to make comparisons, but there was a time when the trade unions had a youth movement. So the young people were introduced into trade unions. The whole idea of the Critical Labor College was a training college, that it actually ran courses for workers to help them to improve their skills in the businesses or whatever enterprises they were working in. So the trade unions have a history of education and training. They have a history of including youth. You may notice around the country, maybe your generation might be aware that when you hear the words like Tuckville, or Tuckboard, the Tuck means TUC, Trade Union Congress. So these were schemes that were built mostly for working class people. And if you went into Tuckville, you'd see the streets are named after famous trade unionists.
Okay.
So it is clear that the role of the trade unions historically was seminal to the evolution of the Guyana state. Even now, although it might be subject to some controversy, trade unions had credit unions. very frequently, because workers' wages were low, they would tend to run out of money before payday, and they would go to the credit union. Sometimes it might be for a health issue or housing issue or family matter, or any private matter. But the credit unions played a very important role in supporting workers in time of need. So trade unions throughout the country and throughout history played a very important role in ensuring that the workers who they represented should have a comfortable life. And we must move away from the concept that trade unionism is only about wages and strikes. It is about the total well-being of the working people. It is not for me to tell the trade unions what to do, but there is certainly need for them to move out of that narrow path of wages. Wages are most important, because that's for sure. But at the same time, the health and safety of workers should be given consideration. There are workers in the hinterland in mining industry, and every now and then there is a cave-in. Who represents them? Sometimes workers are dismissed, as happened in the public sector. Who speaks up for them? People are suffering from COVID and other diseases. Is there a safety net to cushion the impact of these adversities on the working people? So the trade unions are not, museum pieces, historical only. They are a living organization to which workers should look for support. Now, it is quite clear that people have been drifting away from trade unions.
Okay.
You can say that many of the institutions that we were familiar with in the middle of the last century, even the churches, some churches people are drifting away from going to church every Sunday, if they're Christians, or even maybe worshiping at other places. So people are drifting away, and similarly they're drifting away from political parties in terms of card-bearing membership. They're drifting away from trade unions in terms of fee-paying membership. If there's a wage increase or salary increase, everybody benefits. The rising tide lifts all boats. But we need to see the workers' lives and livelihoods in a broader way, and not just for wages and salaries, but in terms of entertainment. Workers' unions used to have clubs. In terms of young people getting training, and credit unions providing money when needed, encouraging thrift. All of these things the trade unions could be doing. So the future is bright for a vibrant trade union organization. We all regret that there is some level of disunity among the trade unions, and in the past we all benefited from trade union unity. In fact, I can recall during the 1960s or thereabouts, every week you'd hear the song Solidarity Forever. Trade unions actually published a newspaper called, I think, the Labor Advocate. But things have changed. And I can only hope that the representation of the workers and the comfort and well-being of workers would see better days, especially now that we have such a vindictive government which is dismissing so many workers without cause. We could do better, and the trade union movement could do more to help workers to have a good life.
Sir, thank you very much for being with me on this program, and it's always a pleasure interacting with you. To your viewers, we say thank you very much for joining us. I'm Gabriela Patram, and on behalf of all of us here at Public Interest, we usually do encourage you and always encourage you to please follow all COVID-19 guidelines. Goodbye.